The emergency broadcast had stopped 3 days ago, and that terrified Marcus Webb more than anything else. He stood at the window of the abandoned radio station on Fletcher Avenue, watching the streets below crawl with the infected. They moved differently now, not the stumbling corpses from the movies he'd watched as a kid, but something worse, calculated, patient, almost intelligent. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool glass, his breath fogging the window as he counted 17 of them circling the building. They knew he was here. Somehow they always knew. Behind him, the radio equipment hummed with static, a sound that had become both comforting and maddening over the past 72 hours. His partner, Daniel Rodriguez, sat hunched over the broadcasting desk, frantically switching between frequencies, hoping to catch any sign of human life beyond their concrete prison. The coffee in Daniel's mug had gone cold hours ago, forming a dark ring around the rim that nobody bothered to clean anymore. Small things like that didn't matter when the world had ended. Marcus turned away from the window and watched his friend work, noticing how Daniel's hands trembled slightly as they moved across the controls. They were both running on fumes, exhaustion mixed with adrenaline and the thin hope that someone somewhere was still listening. Anything? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer from the defeated slope of Daniel's shoulders. Daniel shook his head without looking up, his dark eyes fixed on the flickering dials before him. They'd been broadcasting their own message for 2 days now, a desperate plea for survivors to make contact, to coordinate, to prove that humanity hadn't completely fallen. The silence that answered them was deafening. Marcus moved away from the window, careful to keep his footsteps light. The infected had excellent hearing. That was one of the first things everyone learned when the outbreak began, usually right before they learned it too late. The station's break room had become their living quarters, a cramped space filled with vending machine snacks and bottled water they'd rationed down to the last drop. Marcus checked their supplies again, knowing the numbers by heart but needing something to do with his hands. 4 bottles of water. 6 protein bars. A bag of stale chips. Maybe enough for 3 more days if they were careful, and less than a day if they weren't. His stomach growled in protest, but he ignored it. He'd gotten good at ignoring a lot of things lately: hunger, fear, the screams he'd heard that first night when the city fell apart. A sudden bang against the building's lower entrance made both men freeze. The infected had found the loading dock door. Marcus grabbed the baseball bat he'd kept close since this nightmare began, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. The wood was stained now, marked with encounters he tried not to remember in detail. Daniel finally looked up from the radio, his face pale in the emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of red and shadow. They listened together as the banging continued, rhythmic and persistent, testing the door's strength. The barricade would hold, Marcus had made sure of that, but the sound was a reminder that their sanctuary was temporary, that eventually they'd have to move or starve. "We can't stay here forever," Daniel said, voicing what they'd both been thinking. His accent, usually barely noticeable, became thicker when he was stressed. Marcus nodded, running through their options for the 100th time. They'd seen a supply depot marked on the city map, about 8 blocks northeast. 8 blocks might as well have been 8 miles with the streets as crowded as they were. But the alternative was waiting here to die, and Marcus had already decided he wouldn't go out like that, passive, hiding, hoping for rescue that wasn't coming. The radio suddenly crackled to life, breaking through the static with a burst of sound that made both men jump. A voice, distorted but unmistakably human, cut through the white noise. "This is anyone? Riverside, trapped children?" The signal faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only static in its wake. Daniel lunged for the controls, desperately trying to recapture the frequency, his previous exhaustion forgotten. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, hope and dread mixing in his chest. Someone else was alive. Someone needed help. And somehow that changed everything. The infected continued their assault on the door below, but Marcus was already moving, already planning, because now they had something more dangerous than supplies to risk their lives for. They had purpose. Daniel's fingers flew across the radio controls with renewed urgency, adjusting frequencies in precise increments while Marcus grabbed the detailed city map they'd marked up over the past few days. Riverside, that was the old commercial district near the waterfront, at least 12 blocks from their current position. The voice came through again, clearer this time, and Marcus realized it wasn't just one person but a woman's voice, strained and desperate. "Riverside Shopping Center, 3rd floor, Mallory's department store. 4 adults, 3 children. Running out of time. They're breaking through. The transmission cut out again, dissolving into static that seemed to mock their helplessness. Marcus spread the map across the broadcasting desk, tracing possible routes with his finger while his mind calculated odds of survival. Every path to Riverside meant crossing through the downtown area, which had been completely overrun within the first 48 hours of the outbreak. He'd watched it happen from this very building, seen the crowds of infected swarm through the streets like a flood of rotting flesh and rage. But the word children kept echoing in his head, pulling at something he thought he'd buried when survival became the only thing that mattered. Daniel looked up at him, and Marcus saw his own conflict reflected in his friend's eyes. The war between self-preservation and the desperate hope that humanity meant something more than just staying alive. "We have to go," Marcus said, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Daniel nodded slowly, then grabbed a pen and began marking the map with notation symbols they developed. Red X's marked heavy infected presence, yellow circles indicated possible supply points, and green lines showed routes they'd scouted from the windows. There were no green lines to Riverside. Everything in that direction was marked red or unknown, blank spaces on the map that could hide death at every turn. Marcus checked his watch, 2:15 in the afternoon. They had maybe 4 hours of good daylight left, and moving after dark was suicide. The infected hunted better at night, their other senses compensating for their milky, dead eyes. They spent the next 20 minutes gathering everything that might keep them alive. Marcus filled a backpack with their remaining supplies, while Daniel rigged a portable radio receiver with batteries he'd scavenged from the station's emergency equipment. If they were going to find these people, they'd need to maintain contact to home in on the signal. Marcus tested the weight of his baseball bat, then grabbed a heavy flashlight from the security office that could double as a weapon. Daniel had found a fire axe mounted behind glass in the hallway. He'd broken the case on day 1, and now the axe hung from a loop on his belt, its red paint chipped and faded. The banging on the lower door had stopped, which somehow made things worse. Marcus crept back to the window and looked down at the street. The infected had spread out, no longer clustered at the entrance. Some had wandered away, drawn by stimuli only they could sense, but others remained, standing perfectly still like broken mannequins waiting for someone to wind them up. He watched one of them, a woman in a torn business suit, tilt her head back and forth, testing the air. Her jaw hung at an unnatural angle, broken or dislocated, and dark fluid stained the front of her white blouse. Marcus looked away before his imagination could fill in more details. "There's a service tunnel," Daniel said, pointing to the map's legend. "Connects to the old subway maintenance system. Runs parallel to Riverside Avenue for at least 6 blocks. Marcus moved closer, studying the thin blue lines that represented the city's underground infrastructure. He'd forgotten about the tunnels. Everyone had when the subway shut down 5 years ago due to budget cuts. The entrances would be locked, probably rusted shut, but it was a chance. Better than trying to fight through 12 blocks of infected on open streets. The risk was going underground blind, not knowing what they'd find in the darkness, but every option was a gamble now. Daniel established a broadcasting loop on the radio, a repeating message with their call signs and intended destination, just in case someone else was listening. It was a breadcrumb trail, a way to tell their story if they didn't make it back. Marcus checked the battery on his flashlight one more time, tested the heft of his bat, and took a deep breath that tasted like stale air and fear. They moved toward the station's rear exit, where a fire escape led down to an alley they'd kept clear. Behind them, the radio continued its endless broadcast into the void, a mechanical prayer that someone, somewhere, still cared enough to listen. The fire escape rattled under their weight as Marcus and Daniel descended into the alley behind the radio station, each metallic creak making them wince. Marcus went first, bat ready, scanning the narrow passage between buildings that had once smelled of garbage and rain but now carried the sickly sweet stench of decay. The alley appeared empty, but appearances meant nothing anymore. He'd seen infected wedge themselves into spaces that should have been impossible, waiting with the patience of predators who had nothing but time. Daniel followed close behind, the portable radio receiver clutched in one hand and the fire axe in the other, his breathing controlled but rapid in the oppressive silence. They moved quickly through the alley, keeping to the shadows, their shoes carefully avoiding the debris that littered the ground, broken bottles, scattered trash, and things Marcus refused to look at too closely. The entrance to the maintenance tunnel was 3 blocks east, in the basement of an old office building that had been scheduled for demolition before the world ended. 3 blocks had never seemed so far. At the alley's mouth, Marcus held up a fist, the signal to stop. He peered around the corner onto Madison Street and his stomach dropped. The street was crawling with them, at least 30 infected shambling between abandoned cars and shattered storefronts. Some were fresh, their movements still relatively fluid, while others were further gone, bodies deteriorating but somehow still moving, still hunting. Marcus pulled back and looked at Daniel, pointing across the street to where a gap between 2 buildings offered a possible route. Daniel studied the distance, then checked the radio receiver. The signal from Riverside was still transmitting, fainter now but steady, and he adjusted the antenna to get a better read on the direction. They needed to move east and north, which meant crossing Madison was unavoidable. Marcus counted the infected again, looking for patterns in their movement. That's when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. They were moving in loose coordination like a pack rather than individuals. 3 of them turned simultaneously toward a sound Marcus couldn't hear, their heads snapping in the same direction with unnatural synchronization. "They're learning," Daniel whispered, and Marcus knew he'd seen it too. The infected weren't just mindless anymore. They were adapting, evolving, becoming something worse than the shambling corpses from the outbreak's first days. Marcus gripped his bat tighter and made a decision. He picked up a piece of broken brick from the alley floor and hefted it, testing the weight. Then he threw it as hard as he could down Madison Street, away from their intended path. The brick crashed through a store window 2 blocks south, and the effect was immediate. Every infected on the street turned toward the sound, then began moving in that direction, their pace quickening to something approaching a run. Marcus and Daniel didn't wait to see more. They broke from cover and sprinted across Madison Street, their footsteps loud in their own ears but hopefully drowned out by the commotion to the south. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs as they ran, expecting at any moment to hear the terrible sound of pursuit, the wet growls and scraping feet that meant they'd been spotted. They reached the far side and ducked into the passage between buildings, pressing themselves against the wall as they caught their breath. Behind them, the infected had converged on the broken window, clustering around it, searching for the source of the noise. The office building loomed ahead, a 12-story relic of concrete and glass with most of its windows already broken out. The main entrance was blocked by an overturned delivery truck, but Marcus remembered the parking garage entrance on the east side. They moved along the building's perimeter, constantly checking over their shoulders, until they found the ramp leading down into darkness. The garage gate was partially closed, leaving just enough space for them to slip through if they went low. Marcus clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the black, revealing oil stains on concrete and the hulking shapes of abandoned vehicals. The air grew colder as they descended, and Marcus could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness. The maintenance tunnel entrance was supposed to be on the garage's lowest level, behind a locked door marked, "Authorized Personnel Only." Each level they descended felt like going deeper into a tomb, the weight of the building pressing down from above. Daniel's radio crackled with static and for a moment they heard the woman's voice again, "Please, if anyone can hear this," before it faded. Marcus quickened his pace, the flashlight beam bouncing off concrete pillars and creating shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own, leading them deeper into the unknown. The lowest level of the parking garage was flooded with 3 inches of standing water that had turned black with oil and filth. Marcus swept his flashlight beam across the space, counting 5 abandoned cars and a maze of support pillars that disappeared into the gloom. The sound of their footsteps splashing through the water seemed impossibly loud, each ripple echoing off the concrete walls. Daniel consulted the building's emergency evacuation map they'd found at the entrance, his finger tracing the route to the maintenance access point. "Southwest corner," he whispered, pointing toward the back of the garage where the darkness seemed thickest. Marcus nodded and led the way, every nerve in his body screaming that they were being watched. They found the door exactly where the map indicated, a heavy metal barrier painted institutional gray and marked with faded warnings about restricted access. The lock was old, corroded by years of moisture, and Marcus felt a surge of hope that it might be weak enough to break. He handed the flashlight to Daniel and wedged the end of his baseball bat into the door frame, using it as a lever. The metal groaned in protest, the sound reverberating through the garage like a gunshot. Both men froze, listening, waiting for any response from the darkness around them. For a long moment, there was nothing but the steady drip of water and their own ragged breathing. Then Marcus heard it, a wet, shuffling sound coming from somewhere between the parked cars. Daniel swung the flashlight toward the noise, and the beam caught movement behind a van 20 feet away. Something was back there, moving with the distinctive jerky motion of the infected. Marcus pulled harder on the bat, feeling the lock mechanism start to give way, metal scraping against metal. The shuffling grew louder, joined by a low gurgling sound that made his skin crawl. Come on, Daniel urged under his breath, dividing his attention between the door and whatever was approaching from the darkness. The flashlight beam caught it fully now, an infected man in a parking attendant's uniform, his name tag still pinned to his chest, though the name was obscured by dark stains. The creature's eyes fixed on them with terrible focus, and it opened its mouth in a soundless scream before lurching forward. The lock broke with a sharp crack, and Marcus nearly fell backward as the door swung inward. Go, he shouted, abandoning any pretense of silence. Daniel grabbed his arm and pulled him through the doorway as the infected attendant splashed toward them, moving faster than should have been possible. Marcus slammed the door shut just as the creature hit it from the outside, the impact reverberating through the metal. There was no lock on this side, nothing to secure the door with, so Marcus braced his shoulder against it while Daniel frantically searched for something to wedge it closed. The infected threw itself against the barrier again and again, each impact threatening to knock Marcus off balance. Daniel found a length of pipe on the floor and jammed it through the door handle, bracing it against a bracket on the wall. It wouldn't hold forever, but it might buy them time. Marcus stepped back, chest heaving, and took in their new surroundings. They stood in a narrow corridor lit by emergency lights that still somehow had power, the green glow giving everything a sickly appearance. The walls were lined with pipes and electrical conduits, and the air smelled of mold and standing water. According to the map, this maintenance corridor connected to the old subway system 200 yards ahead. Behind them, the infected continued its assault on the door, the pipe bracing holding but visibly shaking with each impact. They moved deeper into the corridor, forced to walk single file where pipes narrowed the passage. Marcus's flashlight revealed graffiti on the walls, tags from urban explorers who'd ventured down here before the outbreak, along with official warning signs about electrical hazards and structural instability. The corridor branched several times, but Daniel kept them on course using a compass he'd grabbed from the radio station. The sound of the infected battering the door faded behind them, replaced by new sounds, the hum of electrical equipment, the rush of water through pipes, and something else that Marcus couldn't quite identify, a distant rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, they reached another door, this one marked with a faded subway logo and the words "Track Access." Daniel checked the radio receiver and nodded. They were heading in the right direction, closer to Riverside. Marcus tested the door and found it unlocked, opening onto a metal staircase that descended into complete darkness. The thumping sound was louder here, more distinct, and Marcus realized with growing dread that it sounded almost like footsteps, many footsteps echoing through the abandoned tunnels below. Marcus descended the metal staircase slowly, each step deliberate and quiet despite the echoing footsteps that seemed to surround them in the darkness below. His flashlight beam cut through the black, revealing glimpses of the old subway tunnel, curved concrete walls covered in decades of grime, rusted rails that gleamed dully in the light, and the skeletal remains of electrical systems that had powered trains through these passages long ago. Daniel followed close behind, one hand on Marcus's shoulder to maintain contact, the other clutching the radio receiver that occasionally crackled with fragments of the transmission from Riverside. The footsteps they'd heard from above had stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence that felt worse than any sound. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves on a maintenance platform overlooking the main tunnel. The space stretched in both directions, disappearing into darkness that their flashlight couldn't penetrate. According to Daniel's calculations, they needed to head north for roughly 8 blocks, then find an access point that would bring them up near the Riverside Shopping Center. 8 blocks in the open had been dangerous enough. 8 blocks in these tunnels felt like descending into a tomb. Marcus played his light along the tunnel floor, checking for any signs of movement, and that's when he saw them, footprints in the dust and grime, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all heading in the same direction they needed to go. "They're using the tunnels," Daniel breathed, the realization hitting them both simultaneously. The infected had found their way underground, using the subway system to move through the city unseen. It explained how they seemed to appear and disappear, how they could swarm an area so quickly. The tunnels were a highway for the dead, and Marcus and Daniel were about to walk right into it. Marcus studied the footprints more closely, looking for any indication of how recent they were. The dust patterns suggested movement within the past few hours, but the prints led away from their current position, which meant the infected had already passed through this section. It was a small comfort, but Marcus would take anything he could get. They climbed down from the platform onto the tunnel floor, their feet crunching on gravel between the rails. The curved walls created strange acoustics, making it impossible to judge distances or directions of sounds. Water dripped from cracks in the ceiling, forming puddles that reflected their flashlight beam like dark mirrors. Marcus kept the light moving, never letting it rest in one place too long, always searching for threats. They passed an abandoned maintenance cart, its tools scattered across the ground, and Marcus grabbed a heavy wrench, shoving it into his belt as a backup weapon. Daniel did the same, taking a pry bar that looked sturdy enough to crack skulls. The radio receiver suddenly burst to life with startling clarity, the woman's voice cutting through the static. "This is Jennifer Preston at Riverside Shopping Center. If anyone receives this transmission, we are down to our last barricade. They've breached the second floor. We have 3 children here. Tommy, age 7, Beth, age 9, and little Emma, she's only 4. Please, someone, anyone." The desperation in her voice was raw, unfiltered, and Marcus felt it like a physical blow. Jennifer Preston. Now she had a name, and so did the children. They weren't just voices anymore, they were real people running out of time. "We're coming," Daniel said into the darkness, though Jennifer couldn't hear him. He checked their position on the compass and pointed ahead. 2 more blocks, then we should see the Riverside access stairs. Marcus nodded and increased their pace, moving from a cautious walk to a light jog. The sound of their footsteps echoed ahead of them, announcing their presence to anything that might be listening, but speed mattered more than stealth now. They had to reach those people before the infected did. The flashlight beam bounced wildly as they ran, creating disorienting shadows that made the tunnel seem alive, walls pressing in and pulling away with each step. They rounded a curve in the tunnel and Marcus skidded to a halt so quickly that Daniel nearly crashed into him. The flashlight illuminated what lay ahead, and for a moment, Marcus's brain refused to process what he was seeing. The tunnel was blocked, completely filled with infected, not moving, not attacking, but standing perfectly still in the darkness like an army at rest. There had to be at least 50 of them, packed shoulder to shoulder, facing away from Marcus and Daniel, all oriented in the same direction. Toward Riverside. Toward Jennifer Preston and those children. And as Marcus and Daniel stood frozen, trying to understand what they were witnessing, one of the infected at the back of the group slowly turned its head, milky eyes finding them in the flashlight beam. Time seemed to stop as the infected's dead eyes locked onto Marcus. For one terrible heartbeat, nothing moved, not Marcus, not Daniel, not the creature that had spotted them. Then the infected opened its mouth and released a sound unlike anything Marcus had heard before, a high-pitched shriek that wasn't quite human, a signal that cut through the tunnel like a blade. The entire horde turned as one, 50 pairs of milky eyes finding them in the darkness, and Marcus knew they had seconds before the tunnel became a killing floor. "Run!" Marcus shouted, already moving, grabbing Daniel's arm and pulling him back the way they'd come. Behind them, the horde surged forward with terrifying speed, their individual shuffling gaits combining into a thunderous rush of footsteps that shook the tunnel. Marcus's flashlight beam jerked wildly as they sprinted, revealing flashes of the tunnel walls, the rails, the darkness ahead. His lungs burned and his legs screamed in protest, but the sound of the horde behind them was all the motivation he needed. Daniel gasped something Marcus couldn't hear over the noise, then pointed frantically to their right. A service alcove cut into the tunnel wall, barely visible in the chaos. They dove into the alcove just as the first wave of infected reached them, the creatures rushing past in their momentum, unable to stop quickly enough. Marcus pressed himself against the back wall, bat raised, while Daniel swung the fire axe in a desperate arc that caught the first infected to turn into the alcove. The creature went down, but 2 more immediately took its place, clawing and snapping at the narrow opening. The alcove was barely 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide, a maintenance cutout that had become their last refuge. Marcus brought his bat down on an infected woman's skull, feeling the sickening crunch of bone, then kicked another back into the tunnel. They couldn't hold this position for long, the infected were already piling up at the entrance, reaching in with grabbing hands. Daniel's flashlight, dropped in the chaos, rolled across the alcove floor and illuminated something Marcus had missed in their panic. A ladder built into the back wall, leading up to a hatch in the ceiling. "There!" Marcus shouted, smashing his bat into another infected face. Daniel saw it too and immediately started climbing, the fire axe hanging from his belt, the radio receiver somehow still clutched in one hand. Marcus held the alcove entrance, his bat rising and falling in a brutal rhythm, buying seconds they desperately needed. An infected man in a torn security uniform lunged forward, getting close enough that Marcus could smell the rot on its breath before he drove the bat into its throat, sending it stumbling backward. "It's open," Daniel called from above, and Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He turned and scrambled up the ladder, his hands slipping on the metal rungs, the infected surging into the alcove below. Hands grabbed at his ankle and he kicked frantically, feeling his shoe connect with something soft. Daniel reached down and hauled him up through the hatch with strength born of pure terror, and together they slammed it shut. The hatch had a wheel lock like something from a ship, and Marcus spun it closed just as the infected below began hammering against it from underneath. They collapsed on the floor of wherever they'd emerged, gasping for air, their bodies shaking with adrenaline. Marcus's flashlight was gone, lost in the alcove, but Daniel still had his and clicked it on to reveal their surroundings. They were in another maintenance corridor, this one newer and cleaner than the one below. Pipes lined the walls, and Marcus could hear the distinct hum of active electrical systems. A sign on the wall read Riverside Commerce District Utility Access Level 1. They'd made it. Somehow, running for their lives, they'd gotten closer to their destination. Daniel checked the radio receiver, amazed it had survived their flight. The device crackled and Jennifer Preston's voice came through, weaker now, nearly defeated. "This is our last transmission. They're through the barricade. We're taking the children to the roof. If anyone hears this, we tried. God help us, we tried." The transmission ended, replaced by static. Marcus looked at Daniel and saw his own determination reflected there. They hadn't come this far, hadn't survived the horde, just to give up now. The utility corridor had to lead to the shopping center, it was part of the same complex. They ran again, but this time towards something instead of away, following the corridor as it sloped upward. Behind them, the hatch continued to ring with the pounding of fists, but the sound grew fainter with each step. Ahead, Marcus could see a door marked Riverside Shopping Center Basement Access, and beyond it, 3 children and 4 adults who had minutes left to live unless Marcus and Daniel could somehow shift the balance between the living and the dead. Marcus burst through the basement door into the shopping center's lower level, his bat ready, Daniel right behind him with the fire axe raised. The space was a maze of storage rooms and delivery corridors, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in red shadows. They could hear the infected above them, the terrible chorus of moans and scraping feet that meant the horde had made it inside. Following the sound upward, they found a stairwell and climbed, taking the steps 3 at a time. The radio receiver crackled with dead air. Jennifer had stopped broadcasting. The 3rd floor was chaos. Infected filled the main concourse, clustered around Mallory's department store at the far end. They clawed at something above them, reaching upward with rotting arms, and Marcus understood immediately. The roof access was inside that store, and the survivors had made their final stand. There had to be 40 infected between Marcus and his goal, far too many to fight through. But then Daniel grabbed his arm and pointed to the 2nd-floor balcony that overlooked the concourse. A maintenance catwalk connected the balcony to a skylight directly above Mallory's. It was narrow, exposed, and looked like it might collapse under their weight, but it was a chance. They backtracked to find stairs to the 2nd floor, every second feeling like an eternity. Marcus's mind raced with images of those children, Tommy, Beth, little Emma, and what would happen if they arrived too late. The 2nd-floor balcony was mercifully clear, and they ran along it until they reached the catwalk access. The metal structure swayed ominously as Marcus stepped onto it, groaning under his weight. Below, some of the infected noticed the movement and turned their attention upward, reaching uselessly as Marcus and Daniel crossed 20 feet above them. The catwalk ended at a skylight panel that had been installed during the shopping center's last renovation, and Marcus didn't hesitate. He swung his bat and shattered the glass, clearing the frame. "Jennifer Preston," Marcus shouted down through the opening. "We're here to help. Get to the roof." For a moment, there was only silence, and Marcus feared they were too late. Then a woman's face appeared at the roof access door inside the store, tears streaming down her cheeks, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. Behind her, Marcus could see others. A man holding a little girl with dark curls who had to be Emma, another woman clutching 2 older children, and another man armed with what looked like a metal clothing rack. "The stairs are blocked," Jennifer shouted up. "We can't get out." Below, the infected had begun breaking through Mallory's lower-level entrance, flooding into the store. Marcus looked at the skylight, then at the roof access where Jennifer stood. The gap was maybe 8 feet, too far to jump with children, but if they could create a bridge. Daniel was already thinking the same thing, pulling off his jacket and tying it to the fire axe handle. Marcus did the same with his shirt, creating a makeshift rope. It wasn't much, but combined with the catwalk support cables that Daniel was already working to detach, they might manage something. Working with desperate speed, they created a line from the catwalk to the roof access, anchoring it to the skylight frame. It wasn't safe by any definition, but Marcus had learned that safety was a luxury the world no longer offered. The male survivor went first, crossing hand over hand while carrying Emma on his back. The little girl kept her eyes squeezed shut, brave beyond her years. Beth and Tommy came next, helped by the other woman, then Jennifer and the remaining adult. The infected below had reached the 3rd floor, pouring into Mallory's, climbing over displays and each other in their frenzy to reach the living above them. The last survivor, a man named Robert who'd helped Jennifer barricade the store, was halfway across when the first infected reached the roof access door. Marcus didn't think. He slid down their makeshift rope and kicked the creature backward, sending it tumbling into the horde below. He pulled Robert the rest of the way to the catwalk, then Daniel helped haul them both to safety. Behind them, the rope fell away as infected tore at it from below, their prize escaping their grasp. On the 2nd floor balcony, the survivors collapsed in exhaustion and relief. Emma cried quietly into her father's shoulder while Beth and Tommy held hands, their faces pale but determined. Jennifer looked at Marcus and Daniel with gratitude beyond words. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't think anyone would come." Marcus glanced at Daniel, then at the group they'd saved, 7 lives pulled from the edge of oblivion. The shopping center was lost, filled with infected, and they still had to find a way out of the building and back to some form of safety. But as he looked at the children, at the adults who'd protected them, at his friend who'd risked everything for strangers, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since the outbreak began. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would return to normal, but the stubborn, defiant hope that humanity was worth fighting for, that survival meant more than just staying alive. It meant staying human. "We're not done yet," Marcus said, helping Jennifer to her feet. "But we're not alone anymore either." He pointed to the emergency exit at the far end of the balcony, his mind already working on their next move. The infected still filled the building below them, and the world outside remained a nightmare of the dead hunting the living. But they had found each other in the darkness, and that changed everything. 7 had become 9, and 9 could become more. This was how they would reclaim their lives, not in one grand victory but in small acts of courage, one rescue at a time, one choice to help instead of hide. Together, the group moved toward the exit, toward whatever came next, carrying with them the fragile but growing echo of survival that refused to be silenced. The end.